Um, so that when this recording generates, I can send a copy to Lon and to Laura, and it can be used in the presbytery or by any of you as you wish, to refresh your memories or to help other people get on board if you're talking more about this in different groups. So back to you, Lon, now that we're recording.
Yes, I introduce Tom first. You have read material that I presented. Perhaps I'm giving you some details of his work. My encounter with Tom was, I think, the earliest time I was aware, and you were aware of me, was in Denver 25 years ago, basically 24 years ago. And from that point on, Tom has been challenging me anyway, anytime I've heard him or read more books, to really rethink church and to give me an entry point to the emergent church movement that made me feel like I didn't know how to do ministry anymore, quite honestly. It was such a challenging set of messages that Tom was a part of as well. And but very generous, and I've appreciated him, and as a partner in the Tillich Society, Paul Tillich Society. And just so thankful you could be with us to give us the fabric, sort of, that's the context for this book. So with that, I'll ask that you would join me in prayer. Holy Spirit, we're so thankful for the ways in which we can connect with one another. We're thankful that Tom speaks to us from Toronto, and out of generosity is able to give us some context of this new book, Pilgram Band, and this notion of how we can be really actual in ways that we can affect one another, a mutuality of arrangement of relationships in the church, and that to serve well and as creative ways as we possibly can. So guide us as we have conversation and as we pose questions and respond to other people's questions, for that matter. And bless Tom as he leads us during this time. We lift this up in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks, Lon, and thanks, Laura, for arranging the Zoom conversation. Folks, the idea is that we were going to have a look at this new book of mine, Pilgram Band, and I want to thank you for your interest in reading the book and for your willingness to chat with me. And I hope this is helpful. Our conversation is a conversation. I'd like to say a few things to introduce the whole idea and experience of the Pilgram Band to kind of set the stage. But really, it's mainly a Q&A time. It's a time where you can ask questions and I can offer comments, and we can talk among ourselves. And our conversation can be very focused on the first 40 pages of the book that you were asked to look at, or the whole book, or it can go wider afield than that, and that's just fine. We could talk more widely about the emerging spiritual movements of today, or some perspective from that are more international in terms of Christian experience. So there's a lot of ways we can go, and I'm open to go whatever way is most useful to you. And we're going to go at most for an hour and a half. And if we finish earlier, that's fine. And then the recording will be sent to you. But let me first say a little bit, just to kind of introduce the concept and the experience of what I call the Pilgram Band. It emerges out of our growing awareness, I think, of the search for meaning and purpose that is going on in contemporary society, as the church is, you might say, losing influence, but as spirituality or spiritualities are becoming the fastest growing, you might say, movement in religion in North America today. This issue of meaning and purpose is probably more urgent than ever, especially as polarizations hinder us from talking together. We discover that really the search for meaning and purpose is not an academic chore. It's not even a theoretical exercise. It really isn't just about kind of withdrawing into the woods and meditating and doing mindfulness or yoga or whatever, but it is really all about relationships. That in ancient times, even in the times of our grandparents, great grandparents, the way we found meaning and purpose in life was really through relationships and the interaction of people with each other, between generations, between cultures, between languages, between experiences in general. And a lot of that has been lost in the mobility and the fracturing of our society. Some of you know that I've done a lot of work in demographic lifestyle research and written a number of books on that. And we talk about lifestyle segments when we talk about diversity of the public. And even in the years I've been working in the last 20 years, we've gone from 40 to over 72 distinct lifestyle groups that are trackable and identifiable in North America today. And that number continues to rise. And that's not even including what's happening in Australia, New Zealand, and Europe, and South Africa, and elsewhere. So this diversity and this mobility, and of course, in our current climate of skepticism and doubt, the challenge of building relationships and deepening relationships and sustaining relationships for the purpose of sharing wisdom and guidance and support for each other in the quest for meaning in life and the purpose of life, but it's just becoming ever more urgent. I want to say a couple of things about that quest. And the first one is that in contrast, I think, to the modern Christendom world, this is not a quest for faith. This is really not about defining faith or questing after faith. It's a quest for hope. And in a sense, if the three great Christian virtues of faith, hope, and love were set before postmodern people, the priority actually would not really be faith, which was probably true for our great grandparents, and perhaps not even love, which was probably true for we of the boomer generation and so on. But more and more for Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, it's a quest for hope. Is there hope? Is there a reason not to despair? And that really is the urgency that is driving, I think, the Pilgram Band experience. And the other part of that is the mentoring is really not about defining certainties or finding the absolute answers to the big questions. It lives and survives in ambiguity. And so really it's not about certainties, but the Pilgrim Band is about courage. It is about finding hope and building courage in the face of all of the ambiguities that we have in life, so that we have a sense of the meaningfulness, the significance of life, and we have a sense of the purposefulness of life, even though we don't have all the answers about what's going to happen, where it's going, and what is the absolute uncertain, a certain truth about life. I also want to say that that the experience of mentoring, as I describe it in the first chapters of this book, and which I expand to talk about mutual mentoring, which is in fact the ancient way. It was not just one-on-one mentoring, guru type mentoring, but the mutual mentoring. That this it really leads not to programming, but to pilgrimage. And this is again a great contrast from the modern Christendom churchy world in which you and I have been raised, and in going to seminary, at least for me. I mean, I went to several different seminaries, Princeton most notably, and basically we learned about programming. And this is not about programming. This is about pilgrimage. And so it really leans into it. It is borrowing heavily, not from what I call the institutional diocesan past of the church, but it goes way back to the neo-monastic and early pilgrimage aspects of the church. And I'll say a bit more about some of that maybe a little bit later. But this is not a program. And so this mentoring that we're talking about, Pilgrim Band, is, I want to say definitively, not a church growth strategy. Some of you, I mean, Doug, you're recalling, our experiences with Bill Eason when I traveled with him, or when I was last in the presbytery. And I'm pretty widely known for talking about church growth. And the principles of church growth are still there, and they really are remarkably unchanged, although it'd be verbalized in very different ways. But this really is not a church growth strategy. It's a personal growth process. And that's one of the big shifts that I really want to talk about as we move into this, what we call post-Christendom world, this more anti-institutional world. So we don't implement mentoring with a goal of growing our church, although it may well be that within your church communities or your presbytery communities, you may well see the emergence or could nurture the emergence of a pilgrim band, a shared mentoring experience for meaning and purpose. But the outcome, the measurable outcome, isn't really going to be, people in the pews or income in the church, but it may well be a greater influence on the wider community, because the pilgrim band for me is actually replacing the congregation as the primary unit of mission and ministry in the world today. And this is most visible in other countries than the United States at the moment. I saw it very much when I taught and traveled in Australia, New Zealand, and in Canada, and again in South Africa and Western Europe, and particularly, but now Eastern Europe very much, crossing all boundaries, Catholic, Protestant, and so on. But it is happening, it is unfolding in North America today. We're catching up, you might say, in the United States. And the Pilgrim Band, I think, whether it's in social service nonprofit forums or any number of kinds of forums, lots and lots of creativity, is becoming really the mover and the shaker and the primary group through which mission and ministry is actually being accomplished. Whether the congregation resources that, helps that or not. I don't want to talk too much, but I do want to comment that when I think about the Pilgrim Band, you've already read I think in preparing for this, that I often refer to an ancient medieval term, compunction. Are you familiar with that term at all? Jen shaking her head and Molly's nodding and others not quite sure perhaps. But I'm going to just share a definition with you. It's in the book as well. But I just wanted to focus on this because people ask me, why pilgrimage? I mean, what is the motivation for pilgrimage? Why is this emerging in the emerging religious spiritualities of today? Why is this concept of mentoring emerging? And so just to kind of quickly share my screen with you, come down to this screen. And as I say, this is a quote that's in the book. But the word compunction is an ancient word, and it doesn't mean manipulation, but compunction was used by the early monastics to describe what they called a pain of the spirit, or a kind of a suffering from simultaneous two causes. One was a sense of suffering and regret and anxiety about our tendency towards sin. And we may want to talk about that. I mean as you, I think, understand, I mean sin in its broadest and most existential meaning. And simultaneous with that, with our desire for God. I first kind of read this, encountered this in my doctoral studies in Toronto many years ago. And I recommend to your those of you who are good Presbyterians, maybe Brenda, you already have this book in your library, but I recommend a book by Jean Leclerc. That's Leclerc, Frenchman, who wrote a marvelous book called The Love of Learning and the Desire for God. And it's one of the classic books to understand the monastic experience and the pilgrimage experience. And it's in that frame of mind that I talk about Pilgrim Band today. So Leclerc quotes St. Gregory, and he talks about the compunction of the heart is an act of God in us, an act by which God awakens us, a shock. He talks about it in very graphic terms, a shock, a blow, a sting, a sort of burn. God goads us, he says, as with a spear. God presses us with insistence, as if to pierce us. The love of the world lulls, he said, but as if by a thunderstroke, the attention of the soul is recalled to God. And I lift up that quote, as I say, it's in the book, but it is that kind of thunderstroke, I think, that is really precipitating the spiritual movement, which I describe as the Pilgrim Band, or the mutual mentoring experience. And we may want to come back to this a bit, but it connects to the experience that psychologists today are describing as traumatic experience or post-traumatic stress disorder type experience. And the fact that our world today is a traumatized kind of a world. And the trauma, in a sense, is like that thunderbolt that moves us to rediscover the soul. In a number of my writings, I like to say, modern people have denied the existence of the soul until somebody tried to steal it from them. We often don't realize we have a soul at all until an abuser or an attacker or a traumatizer, you might say, in any number of ways in society, tries to steal that or hijack that. And then it awakens in us this sense of soul, and the soul cries out, you might say, for spirit. And the connection of the soul and the spirit is kind of the big connection being made, I think, in emerging religions today. So anyway, I first talked about this in 2002, 2006, as I was traveling in Australia. I wrote a couple books that have been largely unknown. One was Global Positioning for the Soul, and the other was Why Should I Believe You, which was about the declining credibility of clergy. And you can kind of look up some other things. Many ask about the influences on me in writing my books, especially in my later books. Lon, you know, of course, how profoundly I've been influenced by my mentor, Paul Tillich, and the Tillich, the children of Tillich, the followers of Tillich. But also, I'm very influenced by the pre-Nicene fathers. That is by the North African fathers, Origen and Clement, Tertullian, and the greatest of all, Augustine, rather than the post-Nicene fathers, which kind of codified Christendom and the Nicene Creed and so on. I'm also very influenced by the demographic lifestyle research, which has been very much a part of my life. Some of you who know missioninsight.com may know that I wrote commentaries on ministry expectations and spiritual leadership for all 72 lifestyle segments and 19 lifestyle groups in America today, talking about the different expectations in their search for spirituality. And of course, also some of this is my observations as I've traveled all over the place, especially associating with new religious movements, micro charity nonprofits, and so on. So I need to stop. You should have interrupted me a long time ago, Lon. And just simply say it's kind of the result for me of a long journey, which has gone through many different nervous breakdowns and changes, as I think all of you would probably be able to testify as well. And out of that journey, we come to this kind of common interest together. So this last week was the 52nd anniversary of my ordination. So that's a fair time of life in the church and out of the church and along with the church. And each of you brings your own unique experiences to this, and kind of hoping that you'll have a lot of interesting questions and maybe some comments that you'd like to throw in based on your own experiences, and maybe some challenges or disagreements along the way. And I'm interested in all of that. So finally, I'm going to stop. And I've tried to limit myself, but it's hard.
Thank you for giving us some good context there. Really, I open the floor for discussion. Whoever might have a question or a point you would like to make, or what's on your mind as you think about what Tom is describing, but also about how your experience at the church and outside of the church or whatever.
Sometimes it's helpful to start by just letting me ask you, are there just some clarification questions? Usually when I talk to people, they wonder what the heck did I mean by this terminology or this phrase or reference or something like that. And if there are any just clarification questions, I'd be glad to kind of ask, get those out of the way and then move on to things of greater interest to you. But are there any just clarification kinds of questions?
I have one while folks are thinking. At one point, you were talking about the emphasis of preaching in the West versus more of the model of mentoring in the East. Could you give some examples of what that looks like in Eastern spirituality?
Yeah, I think even when we read the sermons from, say, the great Eastern preacher Chrysostom, it's interesting that he's always referring to conversations. That in his preaching he sees as an extension, you might say, of his conversations that he's having with other laity, other clergy, other church people here and there. And a lot of what the neo-monastic experience was a conversation either within a small community of highly disciplined, accountable pilgrims, or between different organizations. And that did carry on in the early monastic movement as a kind of rebellion. Well, not really, but rebellion. But as the church became more institutionalized, Constantinian, you had the neo-monastic movement, which began to grow and to thrive. And we had the abbas and the ammas and the early church fathers and early church mothers. And the monastic experience was very much one of prayer, labor, and conversation. And it's often the conversation, the mentoring, not just between the abbot and the followers, but between the travelers themselves, which is what enriched the monastic experience. And that contrast to me, Laura, because in Western experience, the sermons of Ambrose, and then later on, the sermons of some of the early church fathers and popes, they became sort of the chief means of communicating the faith, the doctrine to people. And I think partly that's because of barbarian invasions and the breakdown of communications and so on. And in Protestantism, we really, I think, did see the emergence of preaching as sort of the primary vehicle of teaching and of conveying to Christian people the content of the faith and the disciplines of the spiritual life. But for me, always when I compare East and West, the East has always been much more involved in the disciplines of prayer and the intimate conversations between elders and seekers and smaller, more highly organized, accountable groupings of Christians who would encourage each other and support each other. So I don't know if that helps, Laura, to describe what I'm talking about. In my own church growth work, I've become more and more aware, and again, I apologize, I'm not trying to sound, I'm talking to a group of Presbyterians, because I don't want to put down preaching. But at the same time, I'm very aware of how the impact of preaching has just continued to decrease. And it can have great impact, but very often it does not anymore. But what is having impact are the conversations the preachers like you have during the coffee hours after the service is over, or the conversations you have out there in the community. But the dinner church movement is a great example of this shift, you might say, from the presentational talk to you might say, to an inspiration message followed by conversation all around the table. So to me, we're moving in that direction of conversation rather than exposit. I was going to say expositation, but that's not a word. But you know what I mean, expository preaching.
Yes, that does help. Thank you. I think Martin was getting ready to ask a question when I typed up, but then also I think Jen, it would be great if Jen could share some of
Post-worship.
post-worship. So Martin was getting ready, I think.
Oh yeah, yeah. So I just had a question, Tom, about your use of the term historical Jesus.
Yes, right. Yeah, yeah.
In the sense of on page 9, you talk about Christian mentoring assumes that the historical Jesus is not only beyond our reach, but also irrelevant to our quest. And
Yeah.
I guess, do you mean historical Jesus in the sense that, I don't know any human being that isn't time bound and doesn't have a historical context. So if I'm going to deal with Jesus, I'm going to deal with a historical context. Or are you talking about the sort of quote unquote search for historical Jesus academic sort of fascination with attempting to unearth some sort of definable or presentable factualities about Jesus's life, for lack of a better term?
And that's a great question, Martin. And I know it when I wrote it, and I've known in subsequent conversation that's a controversial statement. It raises a lot of eyebrows, and I would say probably in the two choices you suggest to me, I'm really talking more about I'm talking more about the irrelevance of the academic conversation about the historical
Right.
Jesus.
Okay.
But on the other hand, I'm also talking about the other. I'm also just talking about historicity in general, because I think the postmodern public, largely unchurched, secular, and so on, the more they become, the more they focus not on the historical Jesus or on the transcendence of God, but rather the immediate experience of the presence of the divine or of the holy. The more they're interested in incarnational experience, the real presence or the immanence, you might say, of God, which for we Christians, we very quickly talk about, well, that's the paradigm for that is Jesus the Christ. That's
Mm,
when we talk about that, that's kind of the values, the convictions, the hope. That's kind of what we mean by the experience. But the actual facticity in history is not really a debate. And there is a third way in which context in which I wrote those words, Martin, which you didn't mention. But that's I've had so many conversations across the church denominational spectrum, and certainly with fundamentalists, and biblical literalists and others, for whom the debate, even the nitty-gritty, nitpicking kind of debate about what Jesus said or what he didn't say or how he said it or didn't say it or this or that. My observation is that that's a conversation and a debate which has lost its audience. That in terms of, the travelers I meet at the airport and the people with whom I've had mentoring conversations in the bar and the coffee house and the emerging generations that have no real sense of biblical history or, well, perhaps any history. But for them, that's just not, you can kind of see their eyes glaze over. And it's really kind of out of that conversation that I'm most likely to say, it is this experiential quality of the immanence of God that we Christians have experienced and seen and largely described as the Christ. That's what matters to people. But it also means that we don't have to put the name Jesus Christ to it. It could be named well, in any conceivable way, which is why a bit earlier when Jen and I were just chatting back and forth and you were pointing out your tapestry, Jen, behind you and the revelations of Krishna and that sort of thing. I don't want to get into a world religions conversation necessarily, but the same intrigue that I find seekers and travelers, as I call them, out there in our world, the same intrigue they have with the appearances of Krishna or the enlightenment experiences of the Buddhas, or that intrigue all has to do with that immanence of God. So I know, Martin, when I say that, I just know all of my Protestant and Catholic friends and Christendom friends and many academic New Testament colleagues are kind of gasping or annoyed with what I'm saying. And I'm not trying to dismiss that conversation. I'm really just trying to say it's not really, from my point of view, relevant to the emerging conversation about God and spirituality today. Is that helpful?
Yeah. That's helpful. I guess I take it from the standpoint of, well, there is no truth outside of history.
Mm.
There's all this talk in my mind about sort of timeless truth, and people talk about that. Well, I'm not a timeless person. I have never met a timeless person. I'm time bound, and so truth is in essence bound in that same time. So I guess I went in a little different, or you went in a little different direction than I thought, but just the whole sort of sense of the historical context of Jesus keeps me centered in a certain way. That if I'm able to say that, Jesus of Nazareth is just this timeless truth, I'm no longer centered in that historical context. But that's not what you're saying. So I appreciate your clarification.
Well, it is illuminating. This connects with just the previous question of a contrast between Eastern and Western thinking. Because from my Eastern point of view, in a sense, I probably wouldn't quite agree with you in talking about there is no truth outside the context of history. And I think this is an East-West difference of opinion. Because the East is a more mystical and at least in the earliest roots of Eastern Christianity with Origen and Tertullian and Augustine, very Platonic. And for them, there is a truth outside of history, that the essence of the good, the beautiful, and the true is
Right.
not necessarily contained within history.
Right.
And that really is probably more where I am. And
Mhm.
and so to me, it's kind of a contrast. I would say I've drifted east in my
Mhm.
life and my spirituality
Mhm.
as a Christian in
Mhm.
terms of how I've come to understand truth. So that's an
Mhm.
interesting contrast to lift up in light of our previous conversation. Were you going to say
Thank you.
something? Oh, sorry. I was
I
looking at
just say
you.
thank you.
Yeah. Oh, you're welcome. Jen, were you going to say something? Oh,
It just my husband's a biblical scholar, works at the seminary, and these are conversations that he and I have had for like 25 years.
oh,
Conversations, I mean, super probably dull for most people, but he sort of insists on there is a historical truth that we can get to. And then I always say, but every piece of history is an interpretation. So how can we
Mhm.
know? And so we've just been spinning on this for 25 years.
Mhm.
So I was just appreciating the conversation.
well, let me ask Lon. You're there also, Lon. You and I have a great debt to our mentor, Paul Tillich. And so, Lon, any comment about, from our perspective in the ontology and metaphysics of Tillich and where he stood in the theological conversation with biblical um, theologians. Any comment about on this subject from you?
Well, the starting point is his trying to square the relationship of the existential and essential reality. So, and he was never willing to fully go one way or the other. So if you hear someone saying he's a strong existentialist and not an existentialist, so or vice versa, you've only got half of him. So there's this mix that he has between taking seriously, and that's what's coming to my mind, a sort of suspicion from the Eastern perspective. I'm passionate about responding historical events, especially the destructive ones and so forth. And how are we faithfully dealing with existence, Tillich would say, I think. And he would go back and forth between, okay, what ought we be, which is what essentialism is, over against what we actually are, which is the existential part of it. And we are constantly in the position of juggling those two things, because entering into strongly and inviting people in our communities to courageously face reality, it is informed a lot. That the way that we do that is informed by what we think reality ought to be. So that element of it to me is very interesting. I think Tillich, in terms of his in preaching, for example, mixes those up as well. He loves to do the meditative sort of work and the existential work, excuse me, the exegetical work. But at the end of the day, he as you see in his three books of sermons, this wrestling with the stuff of life. So we step back, but we enter in again. I think which is part of the ambiguity element as well, bringing both of those together. But
One of the things I appreciated from the mentoring with Tillich, and I think it's so relevant to the conversation about the Pilgrim Band and the spiritual yearning today, um, is his sense that historical situations for him revealed existential predicaments.
Mhm.
And so he would say that the existential predicament, you might say, the existential question is a priori to the historical event. And so he would go back and
Mhm.
talk more about you'll see as I write, the existential anxieties, and I list 6 different existential anxieties that to me drive the quest for God today. Tillich had a somewhat smaller list, but anyway.
Mhm.
And my point being that Tillich would always look beyond historical context to try to see some underlying existential crisis or issue which was begging some kind of more transcendental or essential response. And that response was an ambiguous response to the experience of Christ. But that's why I tend to go to those kind of existential anxieties and how they're met not by answers but by experiences of incarnation. I think that in my book, in one of the small anecdotes, I think I mentioned once one of my experiences as a mentee rather than a mentor was in an airplane sitting next to someone who I discovered to be a lecturer at a university in uh, Oregon, and and he was coming back to Chicago, and he was in his past life he was Jewish, and he was the barber of Auschwitz. And you may recall seeing that anecdote in my book. And we were talking back and forth. He happened to see what I was reading. It was a spiritual nature of some kind. We started to talk, and he had been speaking to students at the university about his experience because he was a Jew in the camp, in the concentration camp, and survived because he was chosen to be the barber who cut the hair and the beards of the guards, and so they kept him alive. And consequently, he still had a barber shop in Chicago at the time. He's died now. Anyway, so we had this conversation. But what was interesting, the reason I say this was interesting in this conversation is that it was not the historicity of the event that really engaged his reflection. It was the existential crisis that the events precipitated within him. Now, that led him to a kind of atheism. And we had a very interesting conversation as I was talking about spirit and God, and he was not, and so on. But the precipitating event was not so much about history at all. It was really about the anxiety that was triggered by the history. And I think that's where I think about spirituality today and the quest for meaning and purpose arising out of trauma, out of the recognition of profound existential anxieties to which we have to look not within history, but beyond history and before history to find answers. And anyway, that's one of the things I appreciated from the mentoring of Tillich, but also some of the other sources I have. Pause. I take a sip of water. People may. Jackie looks like she's thinking. Uh, Doug looks like he's drinking coffee to stimulate brain cells.
I find it interesting. In my full-time job, I'm a drug and alcohol counselor,
Oh,
and I've had people ask me because obviously they know that I have some Christian background, some pastoral counseling background. They ask me, "Am I forgiven?
oh,
Where is Jesus in all of my turmoil, in my addiction, in what I've done to my family members, um in all of this?" And so a lot of those people, the population that I can minister to, have been I don't want to say turned away, ostracized, but kind of ostracized from the church as a corporate body. And so a lot of them are constantly still looking for that spiritual connection, but it's tough for me to have that corporate connection and still kind of guide them toward a more personal spirituality.
Very helpful. Very helpful. Here's a thought, Jackie. Um, uh, I'll start it this way. Um, in my experience with working, mentoring, coaching different generations, for example, and what I've noticed is that some groups of people are mainly caught up in issues, existential traumas or issues related to guilt, and are looking for some sense of forgiveness and acceptance. But other generations are not preoccupied by guilt as they are by shame. And even in the drug, alcohol addiction is something people feel guilty about, and other people feel ashamed about. And the incarnational experience, you might say, that brings healing to the one or vindication to the other, or you might say different kinds of experiences of the immanence of God. So I found, Jackie, as I have conversations also in so many different contexts and places, and different kinds of ages of people, that sometimes it's helpful to speak out of my own experience of incarnational experience as one who has been forgiven and what that's like, as someone who has done wrong or needs to be accepted, and then also as someone who has been shamed or made powerless, and the kinds of cleansing power of incarnational experience. So that forgiveness and cleansing are actually two different kinds of incarnational experience. And sometimes when I'm mentoring and talking with people, I'm kind of doing this mental kind of sort. I'm trying to figure out, what are we really talking about here? Are we talking about the need to be forgiven of something bad that you think you have done? Or are we talking about um, trying to be liberated or cleansed from some sort of entrapment or abuse in which you have been caught up? And depending on where that goes, my conversation in mentoring about the experience of hope can go in two very different directions. Now we can expand that, because as you know, in my, as I talk about 8 different kinds of existential anxiety, I also then talk about 8 different kinds of incarnational experience. And even in scripture, we know that Jesus was present to different people in different ways, as a grace agent. And so part of the mentoring experience I'm finding is kind of helping people even themselves to discern, well, what really is the anxiety that is driving my quest for God? Because often we don't know. And as we begin to understand, well, what is that anxiety? And it may change over our time and life experience. But once we begin to identify that, then we can begin to talk about, well, what is the direction, the quest? What is the experience of grace, you might say, that we're searching for to bring hope, whether it's healing or vindication or acceptance or forgiveness or companionship or whatever into our lives. So I found it very helpful in the mentoring conversations that I've had, or the Pilgram Band process, to help people focus on that existential issue, and then help them focus more on what are they really seeking in terms of the real presence of God, and then finding catalysts to accomplish that. So it's there are a lot of layers, I guess, is part of what I'm saying in the mentoring experience, as we begin, as we go beyond the trauma itself, beyond the history, you might say, to get at the existential issue.
Thank you. That does help. That's very helpful.
You would be in a good position to see some of that, and to ponder a lot of that, as are many people I find in micro charities and nonprofits who have specific encounters, mentoring encounters with different people.
Hmm.
Immigration, homelessness, I mean, he's just keep
Yeah.
spinning it out.
Right. We deal with a lot of that stuff too. It's crazy
Yeah,
how some of those
yeah,
things overlap a lot.
yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
and just waiting.
What are the different contexts within which Pilgrim bands function? And what do you, is there any measure of where they're the most, whether it's going well or if it's not, what seems not, or seems not to be present there when it's not going well? What are the elements that make those groups really, what I suppose, allow for or open up the possibilities for that incarnational sort of set of experiences? Any thoughts about that?
I go in a couple different directions on that, on both questions. And I discuss them in the book as we go along in terms of the journey to some extent. One is to observe that Pilgrim band conversations are messy. They can come and go. They can stop for a time and recur. I've had mentees and mentors reappear after years of absence and so on. So it's a messy type experience. But where the Pilgrim band tends to accelerate in terms of depth and reach, reach in terms of comprehending life in a broader sense, and depth in terms of connecting with God and the divine in a more profound way, reach and depth. Where the acceleration tends to happen is whenever someone has entered into what I call a boundary situation. And you remember our mentor, Paul Tillich, would talk about boundary situations. And by boundary situations, what I'm thinking of, now they might be very historical kind of boundary situations of transitions from career or marriage or relationships or any number of health or whatever. But they also are boundary situations where we're caught between pessimism and optimism, or a boundary situation where we're caught between faith and doubt, or a boundary situation in which we're caught between trust and distrust, or a boundary situation in which we're caught between participating and separating, withdrawing, and back and forth. A lot of ways to talk about these boundary situations, but I find that whenever someone gets into kind of that boundary situation and the anxiety and the stress that generates, that's when the mentoring experience, you might say, intensifies and sometimes accelerates. And it also along the way can enter new obstacles and opportunities and so on. And I talk about how you can identify some of that. But the second direction your question takes me in, aside from kind of sensing when the mentoring conversations are going to get more intense or accelerate, the other is reflecting a little bit on how you measure outcomes. Because you kind of, in any mentoring experience, so are we getting anywhere? Has anything happened here? And to me, I think one has to live with, you have to live through that ambiguity in two ways. And the one is you have to look for what I would call the signs of grace. And I talk about that later on in one of the chapters in the book, that there are signs of grace in terms of gratitude and compassion, and there are signs of grace in terms of reconciliation in relationships and um, uh, um, uh, reconciliation to fate. And so, I mean, I often describe them as sacramental moments. So say, are there sacramental moments when you have experienced communion? Are there sacramental moments when you have experienced rebirth? Are there sacramental moments when you have felt a sense of renewed calling? And if I can help someone review, are there these encounters with the holy? Then I'm going to say, well, these are pluses, these are outcomes. Whenever you have those experiences, you're still in ambiguous territory, but you're moving on. Something good is happening. The last thing though to say is, I think in mentoring and in the Pilgrim band, one has to, again, step out of the historical context and into a more ontological, metaphysical context, because mentoring is to be a part of a greater movement of the spirit. You and I have no idea what impact we have had on another life in the end, nor do we have any idea who will follow and have an impact on life. We're really a part of a great chain, you might say, of mentoring, of spirit. And people come and go, and I don't know. I've had people I've talked to and didn't think anything happened. And years later they come and say how their life had been changed. And on the other hand, I've had people who I don't think found anything of use and help with me, but then found some other mentor down the way, and it was of great help to them. We're just part of a larger net of spirit, and we're only small pieces in this mysterious greater net of the spiritual movement of God in the world. And so we don't really we don't know when we encounter a person like Jackie, when someone comes to you for the first time, you don't really know what they're bringing with them or what mentoring or how the spirit has moved up to this point. And once you've talked with them and worked with them and they disappear, you don't really even know how much impact you might have had for healing or help or whatever as that person goes on. But the mentor has this confidence, this faith that they're part of a greater movement of spirit. That spirit will pursue the person just as they brought this person to you. And there's this kind of greater spiritual awareness of, I'll just say, a kind of a mysterious network, or classically a communion of saints, which we do not know completely and which do not know us completely, but we're a part of it. So again, what I'm saying, Alon, in response is there are certain signs or outcomes we can look for. And we can see acceleration happening in boundary situations. But in the end, you really don't always have any sense of satisfaction or accomplishment or success in any traditional way, because you trust that the spirit will carry people on and still be there for people.
Something I found challenging in the reading was the vulnerability that is needed in these types of interactions. That seems to go contrary to so much of my training. And it takes there's a lot of risk involved with the type of vulnerability that's needed for this type of mutuality and openness. Could you give words of encouragement?
Yeah, I think it is threatening to us, just to any individual or kind of ordinary human being, because we live in a context of distrust. And so to be that vulnerable, to be that honest, in a sense, to kind of be that trusting, whether it's in another individual or in the presence of spirit, is threatening. And I think in the mentoring relationship, that doesn't happen overnight. That takes time. It builds, it grows. And the more trust there is, the more honesty goes deeper and deeper. And so I think there is a real vulnerability in this relationship, in the most intense pilgrim bands, when you've been traveling together for years. And I have people with whom I've been with traveling for 20 years. There's a level of honesty that you reach, which you'd share with very few other people, but you dare to share with each other. Now, having said that, later on in one of the chapters, I talk more about kind of the characteristics of the mentoring experience. And one of the things I comment on is that that mentors carry with them two qualities at least. One is what I call an optimistic attitude, and I spell optimistic OPTI, capital MYSTIC, and optimism and mystical attitude combined. It's kind of what I'm talking about. But also talk about unassuming amity. That's the only language I could say. And unassuming amity is this kind of acceptance and respect and friendship and trust, but which does not make any claims or assumptions about another person and doesn't lay on any expectations or reciprocal responses. So in a sense, that unassuming amity comes closer to the more dispassionate attitudes that we're trained to in counseling, and that kind of keeping a certain emotive distance from people.
Right.
So that comes kind of closer to it. But generally speaking, though, Laura, I think you're quite right. One of the reasons that many struggle with entering a mentoring relationship, either as mentor or mentee. And I would have to say, one of the things, and I know as I talk to so many clergy and coach clergy that holds clergy back from mentoring. They do coaching and they do counseling, but they don't do mentoring because it is a vulnerability and a risk that often is counter to how we were trained, in a sense, as clergy, but also against our instincts, because clergy have been traumatized so often themselves and beaten up themselves that they're even more hesitant in some ways to take that risk. So it's just one more reason why often a lot of the great mentoring experiences are among laity and not among professionals in that sense. Not that it can't be. And if you're familiar with another book I wrote called Spiritual Leadership, it builds on this because it talks about 8 different kinds of spiritual leadership in America today. And it talks about traditional clergy leadership. Those are the first 3, caregivers, enablers, and CEOs. The organic leader of the big discipling church. But then the most postmodern spiritual leaders in America today, which are not usually in the traditional camp of Christendom or church life, but the spiritual leaders having the most impact today, really, I classify as visionaries, mentors, and pilgrims. And that's in the spiritual leadership book that might be of interest to you as you look at this. But this is usually outside the territory of traditional church leadership. But it is very much within the sphere of spiritual leadership in the world, in America today.
If I could just jump in real quick, because I walk around this world with my heart on my sleeve all the time. And Laura, you had mentioned the reflections that we do at our church after the worship service. And so what we do is we have the worship service, and instead of Sunday school, we have people who want to, they don't have to, they can come, and they grab their coffee and their donut, and then we go to the back, into this back room, and we have a conversation about what happened during the worship service. And it is always, it's getting really popular. Like, we run out of chairs. We've had as many as 30 people come and have this conversation. And what I find to be helpful in balancing the sort of professional distance, but also this sense of mentoring and exploration, for me, has been this sort of metaphor of play. Like, we're just in this room to explore. We're just in this room to play. We're not in this room to double down on any kind of doctrine or any kind of set of faith beliefs. We're just here digging in the sandbox and discovering what we can discover together. And that has sort of enabled me to be the pastor and then to also say, I don't know about that one. Or well, that's one way to look at it, and then here's another way that our tradition looks at it. And so having this sort of atmosphere of play takes off a lot of the intensity that, oh, I got to share my deepest, darkest secrets. It just like loosens things up.
Well,
Yeah.
that's really interesting. I mean, and of course, play is one of the most honest things you can do. Play is far more honest than seminar discussion, for example. And so play was actually celebrated by the anonymous mystic who wrote The Cloud of Unknowing, as you may know, that how God plays with us. So playing is an opportunity to reveal and to trust and to be radically honest. And I think it's terrific what you're doing here, because it's a good example, I think, of how the conversation, and I see mentoring moments here. It may not be a mentoring extended conversation, but it's like mentoring moments. A single sentence, a word, a laugh, an expression. These are mentoring moments that convey profound meaning and speak to the existential anxieties that people bring with them into this conversation. It's not unusual in that kind of play to suddenly shift into tears. And it's that kind of emotional dynamic. Now, so I think what you have is an opportunity that's ripe to build potential mentoring relationships beyond that. You may find that certain people talk to you more often or want to talk to you later, or you have, and you can begin. I mean, I offer some suggestions on, I hate to use the word structure, but how you can kind of build a mentoring conversation or relationship around that. And what I sense then is that you are neither preacher nor teacher, but catalyst. And as a catalyst, that's very much a mentoring posture. By being yourself, or by being humorous, or by being able to laugh, and you're a catalyst for that kind of honesty to be able to come out and to interact with that. And as people come to you, and maybe there's more question, more, you may well find that there is a mentoring relationship that builds out of that, and then even a kind of a Pilgram band that builds out of that. And it could be virtual, and it could be physical, and it could be, and that to me is one of the most helpful things you could do in a church to have impact on the seekers and the spiritual travelers who are disguised as church members. I mean, they're not meant, they don't, membership is not, but they're looking. They're seriously experimenting. They're diligently seeking, and sometimes they're much more conscious than you think about the anxieties that drive their quest for God. And you create an environment like this where that honesty begins to surface, and you can begin to be that trusted mentor. So this is a great, to me, it's a great, exciting story, Jen, that you're talking about, because you have this potential in your ministry and leadership to be a mentoring leader. And that's different than being a CEO leader or a caregiving leader or what I call a facilitating or enabler leader, all of which I was trained to do at Princeton, but I was never trained to do anything else. And so this, it's not disciple making as in but the kind of small group multiplier kind of person. And you have some people there who do that well, but this is a different kind of mentoring leadership. So this is a great place to build from. And I think it's a great example of how you see the urgency and the hunger, which is not really elicited so much by worship and preaching, although it can stimulate some of that, which you've tried to do in the post-worship conversations. But I think you also find that it then starts to happen outside of worship and hospitality. People have often asked me, well, how do you start a mentoring conversation? And I always say, I never start a mentoring conversation. They always come to me. They always start with me. I mean, it just, if you have the openness to the Spirit, the humility to see, if you have the eyes to look behind the circumstances, to the anxieties, if you position yourself in the Spirit, then the opportunities, they happen. I mean, people come to you, and you find yourself in these conversations. You didn't even search for them, and maybe you didn't even want them. I mean, personally, I'm an extreme introvert. I suspect you're more of an extrovert, but I don't know. I'm very introvert. I'd rather be left alone in a way, and yet these conversations will happen. So to me, that's a really good example of how the church is kind of leaning in, how you are leaning in to this new opportunity of mentoring and of, you might say, following the spiritual pilgrimages of people who are really, they're in your church for a time. Like a pilgrim is in a way station. They stopped for some coffee and refreshment, and then they sat at the table a while. And whether you know it or not, they're on their way again. They're on the journey again. And you spent this time, these moments in mentoring with them. You might walk with them into the future, or you might just have to trust to the Spirit that they will find one of the others here around the table or whatever. It's a great example.
We're at 7:46, Tom, so last 14 or 15 minutes.
Well, it's time for some last questions. I mean, Cliff and Molly haven't really said much, and you don't need to, but if you'd like, this is a good opportunity. Brenda as well. I mean, and there may be other questions or thoughts. Anything that I have said, which is really affirming, or is there anything here that has been upsetting, or challenging, or thought-provoking?
I appreciate your book and your thoughts. I will admit some frustration also in that I myself love the approach of the seeker and reading Augustine and Miguel de Unamuno and Tillich and others, but I have to say in our church, it just is, that's not where folks seem to be. And, I realize there are a lot of ways that I can grow certainly and become more of a mentor, more of a, creating an opportunity for folks to experience God and the incarnation. But I find the translation difficult from what I'm reading in your book and my preaching experience.
And I really understand that. And I think that frustration is very common. Just again, speaking biographically, I'm not a good speaker to a large group of people, but I was once asked to speak at the annual conference, a Methodist annual conference, and in Ohio. And there must have been, probably 1,000 people in the room. And I tried to speak on this subject. And I don't think I've ever experienced such a complete failure of communication as I did at that time. I think that when you look at the Christendom church and that for the Christendom Church, the concept of the Pilgrim Band is difficult for a lot of people to grasp. And it's also true that I think for a lot of people, they don't want to grasp it. I mean, the concept is Christian education and fellowship and pastoral care and all those great things about the church. But this sense of personal growth and spiritual growth is intimidating and to some, to even many. And I think that for many church people, and I do so many church consultations, for many church people, their expectation of the clergy is that you're a caregiver, that you're a facilitator and a fundraiser, and a manager, and that in some ways you're a builder and a preacher. For a smaller minority, they expect the pastor to be what we call a discipler, someone who is really maturing people from seeker to deeply faithful, committed Christian. And there are a few within the church that are looking for visionaries, but actually for many of the people who are looking for the mentor and pilgrim kind of leader, they are not connected with the church, or they're at the fringe of the church.
Right.
So what I would suggest, Molly, is they're there, but you're going to need to look for them at the edge and the fringe. They may not even be the regular worship attenders. And I'm not sure what the tactic might be in order to invite them or connect with them or whatever, but it is often outside the traditional churchy environment. And so you think how many times you've connected with someone at a funeral or at a wedding, occasionally at a baptism, but often maybe at some community event, or especially if you are involved with a nonprofit or some social service in a more engaged, kind of hands-on personal way, then you'll have more opportunities, I think, than in a traditional churchy life to not only make these mentoring connections, but to begin to stretch yourself as a mentoring leader. And because I don't know that they are that prevalent within the established church structure. And I'm not trying to put people down, because caregiving and fellowship and Sunday worship and all, and Christian education is all good stuff. But at the same time, the traumatization that we're feeling in our world today is calling out from leaders like yourself. It's kind of like a different kind of ministry, a different kind of spiritual presence. And there's where the mentoring and the Pilgrim Band comes in. So I think I would encourage you to kind of look at that edge, that fringe, and try to develop that relationship out there. And and I know sometimes, I've talked to many clergy who are changing paths, and they're actively looking to do full time what I'm suggesting you do kind of on the side. And so, but that's, I think, what a lot of clergy are facing, is that a lot of the mentoring opportunity is with, you might say, the wider spiritually searching public that actually are alienated from or just disconnected from the established religions.
Thank you.
Great question. Great comment. Thank you, Mo.
Something else, Tom, is that strikes me is that I can list relationships that I've had that in which the other has really been my mentor.
Yeah.
As being invited into deeper relationship and reflection and so forth, and because they care for me for one reason or another, So you may not be the starter of it. You can be pulled in also in a sense to it.
Yeah, that's right. And it is both ways. I mean, you cannot, in the end, you cannot be a mentor without being a mentee. And in the end, if you're a mentee, you become a mentor. It is relational in that sense, in the end.
I think it's an interesting group we've assembled tonight. All the folks you have with you are very deeply committed to this presbytery in different ways, but I can also think of really meaningful conversations I've had with each one of these folks that are together. And so I'm thinking through, because I really resonated with your little add-on that perhaps clergy also go through these stages of being spiritual seekers and having moments of crisis. How can we be a pilgrim band together? How can we encourage this kind of relationship amongst our clergy? We all promise to be a friend to our colleagues, but the ways we have to work together sometimes are an impediment to that. And how can we open up opportunities for to be this mentor mentee to each other?
That's a really helpful comment, Laura, because I do work a lot. I do a lot of coaching with clergy, and my sense is that for many clergy I talk to, there's a real hunger to participate in a pilgrim band themselves. They feel very much in a boundary type situation, often in a frustrated kind of situation, and they're looking for that kind of mutual honesty and mentoring as they go along. And I think in some ways, again, it sounds like a very odd thing to say. It's probably easier for a plumber or an electrician to enter into a pilgrim band than for many clergy to do so. Partly because of the sense of honesty that you just commented on, the vulnerability that is there. And yet clergy are finding that, but sometimes it's not among immediate clergy, it's cross-denominational,
Mm.
and sometimes it's cross-disciplinary. More and more clergy I find are in pilgrim bands alongside of social service and nonprofit CEOs, or even people from the middle management business sector, or just from other sectors entirely, even military. So clergy are finding the pilgrim bands, but sometimes it's harder to do that in your own profession. Our time is about out, and so I thought I would at least share this as a kind of closing. And I just want to share my screen here if I can. There. Because a lot of people ask me, whoops. A lot of people ask me, well, do I have the potential of being a mentor? Am I able, am I called to try to assemble and lead a pilgrim band? The kind of question that maybe, Jen might ask herself, or Jackie, you might ask yourself in terms of your work. And I just raise these questions for you to kind of ponder. You're ready to lead a pilgrim band if you have that sense of humility before the awesome power and love of God, and don't pretend to know everything. If that's true for you, then maybe you're ready. Yes, if you urgently desire to be with God and shape your lifestyle around God's purposes, and if that's a passionate desire, an urgent desire, not just a weekend dream, then you're ready to lead a pilgrim band. Do you actually remember? Can you bring to consciousness experiences of the holy when God has profoundly impacted your life, changed the course of your life? And maybe it was, as clergy, your original sense of calling. As a minister, maybe it's other things. I find that clergy actually forget the experiences of the holy and need to recall them. Maybe because it's too painful to remember them. But do you have that humility before the power and love of God? Are you surrendering your kind of know-it-all-ish attitudes do you desire to be with God? Do you remember experience of the holy? And weak as you might feel you might be, inadequate as you feel you might be, do you have personal experiences of victory? in the Spirit that you could share with others that would give them hope? Have you actually had experiences of mentoring? As Lon was reflecting, have you had experiences as a mentee that have shaped your life in even unexpected, amazing ways? And yes, do you have the experience of or willingness to be in serious systems of accountability and are not afraid to be held accountable? I mean, to me, those are the questions. Those are the things I would ask someone if they're thinking, oh, is God asking me to become a mentoring leader, to become someone who's a catalyst to a Pilgrim band? And if you kind of respond yes to these things, then you can surrender the Spirit and see what opens up for you.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Well, I want to thank you for being a part of this. Thank you very much, Lon, for inviting me to join you, and Laura for helping facilitate. And it's been nice to meet everybody. You know or can know my website and my email. If you have any questions at all, I'd be glad to respond. And I will hopefully generate this as a recording and send it to you, Laura, so that you have it for anything you want to use it for. But thank you,
Wonderful.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and God bless. I'll sign off.